With a baby on the horizon, this couple needed extra space in their home. They planned to remodel their house, but never expected to find an old safe during the renovation. They were curious about the safe contents, but everything would change once the landlord arrived. Because he had something very interesting to say. Couple finds old safe during renovation, then their landlord tells them this. Mark and Stacy lived happily in their rental home, and soon, it wouldn't be just the two of them. They were overjoyed when they found out Stacy was pregnant, but after the joy came doubt. Not because they were worried about being bad parents, but because they didn't know if their house was big enough. The couple thought about it hard and soon realized their house was too small for them to start a family. Of course, the baby needed a room, but there wasn't one to spare. They liked this home very much and didn't have money to get something bigger, but there was a solution to their problem. And that solution was a remodeling. The couple thought it out and planned the perfect renovation. Since Stacy was pregnant, all the hard labor fell into Mark's hands, but he didn't mind. He got his mind on it and got to work, but something bothered Stacy as she watched Mark tearing down the first wall. The two of them had planned this renovation without contacting the landlord, which bothered her. She had told her husband they needed to do that, but he was convinced it didn't matter as long as they paid rent. But her feelings couldn't be ignored any longer, so she decided to call the landlord, but then, as Stacy grabbed her phone and dialed the landlord, Mark finally broke the first wall. Due to its collapse, some of the boardings of the floor also came loose and her husband let out an excited yell. Stacy wasn't close enough to see what happened, but it seemed like her husband had found something interesting. Stacy heard the line ringing as she approached her husband, who was busy on the floor. Mark moved some of the remaining floorboards and pulled on something beneath the floor. When Stacy saw it, she couldn't help but let out a gasp of surprise, and then the landlord answered his phone. "Hello, Pete speaking." The landlord's voice woke her up from staring at her husband. Stacy rambled at first, but then found her footing. She explained they were renovating the house and just stumbled upon something interesting. "There appears to be a rusty cube thing hidden under the floorboards," she said. "What?" Pete reacted furiously and demanded that they stop immediately. "Don't do anything until I'm there. I'm on my way," after which he hung up. Stacy stood in the middle of the room, frustrated at her husband. "I was right. We had to notify him before doing anything. He sounded outraged," she said. Mark looked up at her with a sorry expression on his face. Stacy's mind was racing, and she became very worried. The couple stared at the broken wall and realized they were in trouble. The landlord sounded furious about them renovating the house, but they would soon discover the real reason he was angry. Not much later, the doorbell rang. Stacy hurried to the front door with quivering breath and opened it. She didn't even get the opportunity to welcome the landlord in. "Where is it? Where is it?" Pete said as he forced himself into the couple's home the moment the door opened. Stacy was taken aback by Pete's behavior and hesitated momentarily, but followed him inside. "The broken wall?" she asked, confused. But the landlord wasn't interested in the wall. "What broken wall?" Pete reacted frustratedly. "Where is the weird discovery you and your husband made?" "The square box." He rushed through the house. "This way," Stacy said to the landlord as she pointed him in the right direction. As they arrived, Mark was still busy with the floorboards. He looked up when they entered the room. "I've tried my best to remove all the debris, but it's not completely free, and it's very heavy," he puffed. Stacy looked at Pete as he approached her husband, and for a quick second, a shocked expression appeared on his face. But as quick as it seemed, so quickly, he was able to regain his stale face and knelt down beside Mark. "Grab that and pull those away," the landlord instructed with a stern voice. Stacy watched how Mark and Pete removed the last pieces of debris together. When everything was removed, they stepped back, and Stacy could see what the thing was. She and her husband both gasped as they stared at the old rusty safe that was now visible. What was that doing there? The room fell silent as everyone was confused by the finding, or at least that was what Stacy thought. But as she switched her gaze between her husband and the landlord, she noticed he wasn't fazed by the finding at all. She even thought she could see some tears as he mumbled something. Stacy pricked her ears to be able to hear it. "I'm sorry, Father. I thought you were crazy," the landlord whispered. The words greatly confused Stacy. When she looked at her husband, she could see he heard the same thing. It seemed like Pete knew more about this, so they confronted him. "What is this thing? What do you know?" Stacy asked, trying to sound confident and not confused. A silence followed, but eventually, the landlord sighed deeply and stood up. He probably realized there was no point in not telling them. "This was my father's dying wish," he said, as if that would clear everything up. The couple stared at each other and wanted to ask more questions, but before they could, Pete continued. He explained that last year, his father suddenly became very ill, and on his deathbed, he told Pete to find and protect the safe. But this greatly confused him at the time. "We didn't have a safe as far as I knew," Pete said, his eyes watery. The landlord explained he had searched his entire house for the safe and eventually gave up. "The moment you called, I had a feeling this might be it," he said. Now his final words finally make sense. Stacy and Mark were in disbelief after hearing Pete's story and didn't know how to react. Stacy was still trying to wrap her mind around it. There was a safe hidden in the wall that needed to be protected. What could be so important to be hidden that well? What was inside? Stacy wanted to ask Pete all the questions that popped up inside her mind, but the moment the landlord finished his story, he wandered around the house and didn't respond to their questions. The couple stared at him as he seemingly aimlessly walked through their house while mumbling to himself. What was he doing? Stacy tried to get through to him, but nothing worked, and she became slightly worried about him. She walked back to her husband and expressed her feelings. Was the discovery of the safe too emotional for him? But before Mark could respond, the landlord suddenly reappeared with a crowbar and knelt beside the safe. The couple curiously stepped closer to the landlord, who was trying his best to get the safe open. At first, Stacy thought it was hopeless to try and open it with a crowbar, but she soon realized it was possible. The safe was old and rusty, so the landlord got it open with some effort. The moment the safe's door opened, the couple inched closer to get a look inside. But the landlord only opened the safe very slightly and placed himself in front of it so that Mark and Stacy couldn't look inside. The couple was torn between curiosity and respecting Pete's privacy, eventually deciding to wait. But that didn't mean watching the landlord from a distance and seeing him move the safe's contents wasn't hard or frustrating. They wanted to know what was inside and what was going on. Then, Pete suddenly closed the safe and stepped back. There was a note in his hands, and he was quietly reading it. The mysterious note only made the couple more curious, and they waited impatiently to find out what was going on. Stacy watched the landlord closely as he read the note, and she could see the cogs turning inside his head. Then, he suddenly looked up furiously at the couple. "What is it?" Stacy asked, concerned. The landlord's face turned red as he opened his mouth. "You need to get out of this house now." Pete yelled at the couple furiously, causing them to startle. Mark and Stacy looked at their landlord with confused gazes and didn't know how to react. But Pete kept shouting at them and approached them. Slowly but surely, Pete came closer, demanding that they get out. He was still holding the crowbar, which made the situation very intimidating. Stacy grabbed her husband's hands and squeezed them. She was afraid and didn't understand what was happening. "Get out!" Pete yelled again as he waved the crowbar above his head. The furious landlord was now really scaring Stacy, and she pulled her husband toward the front door. "All right. We're going," she exclaimed to Pete, who followed closely behind. When they left their house, they heard the door close with a loud bang. The couple was now standing alone in their yard, incredibly confused and anxious. They both stared at the closed front door, and Stacy thought about what was happening inside. What just happened, she eventually asked when she processed the sudden events. But her husband just shrugged. They didn't understand any of it. What did that note say? Why did he act like that? Since Mark and Stacy came here, their relationship with the landlord was fine. It wasn't like he came over for a social visit, but they never had any problems and no reason for Pete to behave like this. He was normally a very calm and generous person. Stacy was worried something terrible was going on. Then, a damning thought suddenly struck her. Was Pete going to let them back in? Or did he want them permanently out of the house? Stacy rubbed her hands over her belly. Had their renovation gotten them in more trouble than expected? But it wouldn't be long until they would know their fate. When Stacy shared her worrying thoughts, the couple started panicking. If they weren't allowed back, they had a big problem. There has to be something we can do, Mark said, trying to sound hopeful. As the couple was thinking of ways to mend the relationship with Pete, they were startled by the front door opening. The couple anxiously looked toward the door. What was Pete going to do with them? But to their surprise, the landlord's expression had changed entirely. His face was back to its normal color, and he looked calm and collected. He cleared his throat and said, "I owe you an apology and an explanation." The sudden change in the landlord's behavior shocked the couple, who didn't know how to react. Stacy was the first to recover and quickly accepted Pete's explanation. She was eager to get to the bottom of this and was grateful when Pete invited them back inside. But Mark and Stacy didn't know what to expect. The couple followed Pete to the living room, where he sat down and gestured for Mark and Stacy to do the same. Then, the landlord laid the note on the table and said something surprising. "This note was left for me by my father." Stacy saw tears appear in his eyes as he said it. It was clearly a hard subject for the landlord, and the couple said nothing out of respect. Pete explained that the note detailed that this house had been in their family for a long time and was like an heirloom. His father's dream was to bring it back to its former glory. But he never managed to do that, Pete said as he wiped away some tears. Instead, he gave it to me, but the dream remained. The landlord explained it became too much when he realized he had been renting the house all this time. The further the explanation progressed, the more nervous the couple became. Pete explained that he had never considered this house valuable, but now that he knew the history, he had to make a hard decision. "It was a mistake ever renting this place, and I'm very sorry, but you can't rent it anymore," he said. This was what the couple had been dreading, and they panicked. Mark didn't accept this situation and got angry. "This can't stand. We're about to have a baby. Where do we go?" he shouted. But the landlord remained calm and told them he wouldn't let them stand in the cold. "You found the safe. For that, I have to repay you," he said. Mark didn't know what to say and sat down after lunging up from anger. "What do you mean?" Stacy eventually asked when Pete didn't show any sign to clarify his promise. A smile appeared on his face as he explained he couldn't let a pregnant woman live on the streets. "I have something in mind." Curious to know what he had in mind, Stacy pushed him to share his idea, and eventually, Pete told them that he would help them find a new place. On one condition, he added when he saw the smiles on the couple's faces. "You have to help me renovate this place," he told Mark. The couple took time to discuss this option but soon realized they had no choice. They had to trust the landlord and hope he would help them find a place as he promised. "Okay, I will help you," Mark said. The couple stayed in the house while renovating, but once it was done. When the house was finished, Pete was thrilled. It was a completely different house, and the landlord thought this was precisely what his father had dreamed of. The couple was happy for him, but they were also worried. It meant they had to go. Was Pete going to live up to his promise? The couple followed the happy landlord around the newly remodeled house. When Pete turned around and looked at Mark and Stacy, it was as if he knew exactly what they were thinking. "Don't worry. I have the perfect idea," he said, trying to reassure them, but the couple remained unsure. It seemed the landlord noticed their hesitation. He turned toward them and asked them to follow him. Curiously, the couple followed him, but when he got in his car, they hesitated again. "Come on. I have to show you something," Pete said. Mark shrugged and got in, after which Stacy followed. Where were they going? After just a short drive, Pete stopped in front of a lovely house. Stacy could swear she remembered this house from something but didn't know where. When everyone was out of the car, Pete gestured to the house and handed over the keys. You can live here. I hope it's to your liking, he said. Mark and Stacy couldn't believe what they heard and stared at Pete and the house. Then Stacy suddenly remembered this was Pete's house, and they came here to sign the rental contract. This was something they couldn't accept, but the landlord kept insisting. This is your payment for helping me, he said. The couple went inside, and Stacy started to sob. The house was perfect. No matter how hard they tried, Pete didn't accept their refusal and soon left them in their new home. Soon after, Stacy gave birth to a beautiful daughter, and they made Pete the godfather after becoming close friends.